Mexico, 1968. Part 1. Withering Dreams and Silent Prayers. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the smudged windows of Lupita's florist shop, casting a dull, golden hue over the wilting flowers that lay scattered across the counter. The once bustling shop, filled with vibrant bouquets and the sweet scent of fresh roses, now felt like a shell of its former self. Dust lingered in the corners, and the shelves, which used to overflow with blooms, stood barren and tired. Lupita stood behind the counter, her fingers trembling as she gently touched the petals of a single rose. It was her last healthy flower, or at least it had been. Now, even it had begun to wither, the crimson hue fading to a dull brown at the edges, its stem weak and drooping under the weight of its decline. Her heart ached at the sight, as though the flower's slow death mirrored the fading hope in her chest. She had spent years building this small business with her mother, Maria. Together, they had turned a modest flower cart into a beloved neighborhood shop. Every morning, they would greet customers with warm smiles and fill the streets with the fragrance of roses, tulips, and lilies. They had been the heart of the neighborhood. People came to them not just for flowers, but for comfort, for stories, for laughter. But now, that joy had evaporated like a morning mist under the harsh light of reality. The economic crisis gripping Mexico in 1968 had hit her shop with a force she hadn't expected. People no longer had money for luxuries like flowers. The colorful market days were gone, replaced by the grim necessity of survival. As her customers struggled to put food on the table, the idea of buying flowers seemed frivolous. Lupita understood that, but it didn't lessen the pain of watching her beloved roses wilt, unloved and unwanted. Her eyes wandered around the shop, taking in the shelves that once brimmed with life. The walls, once vibrant with paintings of flowers and sunshine, now seemed to close in on her. The sounds of the bustling street outside were muffled, as if the world was moving on without her, leaving her trapped in this fading dream. The silence inside the shop was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the old wooden floor as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. But the weight she felt was not just physical. It was the crushing burden of failure, of watching everything she had worked for slip through her fingers like sand. Her mother's illness had worsened in recent months, and the medical bills were piling up. Lupita had sold almost everything of value to pay for treatments, but it wasn't enough. The money was gone, the shop was dying, and with it, her hope. A tear slid down her cheek, quickly followed by another, until she could no longer hold back the flood of emotion. She leaned on the counter, her head resting in her hands, and let the tears flow freely. The exhaustion of trying to be strong, of carrying the weight of her mother's health, the shop, and her own crumbling spirit had finally caught up with her. "Why, God?" she whispered, her voice trembling with despair. "Why is this happening to us? What did we do to deserve this?" Her thoughts drifted to her mother upstairs, lying in bed, weak and pale. Maria had been her rock for as long as she could remember. Even in the toughest of times, her mother had always found a way to smile, to offer a word of encouragement, a reminder that faith would see them through. But now, Maria was fading, much like the flowers Lupita held in her trembling hands. Lupita glanced at the framed photograph on the counter, a picture of her and her mother standing in front of the shop on its opening day. They were both younger then, their smiles wide and full of hope, their arms wrapped around each other. The shop had been new, the flowers abundant, and the future seemed bright. Now, that picture felt like a relic of a life she barely recognized. Wiping her tears, Lupita straightened up, determined to keep moving, to keep fighting, though every fiber of her being felt like giving up. She picked up the last rose, the one that still clung to a hint of color, and carefully placed it in a small vase by the window. As she did, the bell above the door jingled softly, and for a fleeting moment, her heart leapt with hope, thinking perhaps a customer had come. But the door remained closed, the shop empty. Lupita exhaled slowly, the weight of her situation pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She knew that unless something changed soon, the shop would close for good, and she had no idea how she would continue paying for her mother's treatment. She felt trapped, cornered by circumstances beyond her control, like a flower that had been cut from its roots, slowly dying in a vase with no chance of survival. "I don't know how much more I can take," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she sank into the chair behind the counter. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her apron, her mind racing through countless scenarios, none of which ended well. She was out of ideas, out of money, and nearly out of hope. The evening sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floor. The light seemed to highlight every flaw, every crack in the floorboards, every speck of dust that had settled on the once gleaming shelves. It was as if the shop itself was mourning its slow demise, just as Lupita's heart mourned the loss of everything she had worked so hard to build. As the shadows grew longer, Lupita felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. It wasn't the calm of peace or acceptance, but the numbness that comes when there are no more tears to cry, no more strength to muster. She looked once more at the single rose in the window, its petals sagging under the weight of time and neglect, and felt a connection to it. She was that rose, beautiful once, full of life, but now wilting, her strength fading, her future uncertain. In the fading light, Lupita made a decision. She would go to the church tonight. She would pray, not just for her mother, but for herself. For strength, for guidance, for a sign, anything that could give her a glimmer of hope. She stood, her legs weak but resolute, and made her way to the back of the shop, where she kept a small bundle of her remaining roses. They were wilted, but they were all she had left. Lupita carefully wrapped them in brown paper, tying them with a frayed ribbon, and held them close to her chest. These roses would be her offering, her last act of faith, her final plea to the heavens for a miracle. With a bundle of dying flowers in her hands and her heart heavy with desperation, Lupita stepped out of the shop and into the cool evening air. The city around her buzzed with life, but for her, the world had grown still and quiet. As she made her way toward the church, she felt the weight of each step, as though the very ground beneath her was trying to pull her back, to keep her from reaching her destination. But she pressed on, her mind focused on one thing: the hope that, somewhere in the silence of her prayers, God was listening. Part 2. A plea in the silent sanctuary. The cool evening air wrapped around Lupita as she made her way through the narrow streets of the city, her bundle of wilted roses clutched tightly against her chest. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of her worries was pulling her deeper into the earth. The streets, usually alive with the sounds of children playing and vendors calling out their wares, seemed eerily quiet tonight. It was as if the city itself had fallen silent, in mourning with her. Ahead, the silhouette of the old stone church came into view, its worn facade bathed in the soft glow of street lamps. The church had stood there for centuries, a silent witness to the lives and struggles of generations before her. Its massive wooden doors loomed large as she approached, the iron handles cold to the touch as she pushed them open. The heavy door creaked, the sound echoing through the vast, empty nave. Inside, the air was cool and thick with the scent of incense, mingling with the faint aroma of old wood and stone. The flicker of candlelight cast dancing shadows along the walls, illuminating the rows of wooden pews that stretched out before her, each one empty. Lupita stood at the entrance for a moment, letting the stillness wash over her. There was something both comforting and haunting about the emptiness. It was a sanctuary, but it was also a reminder of her solitude. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way down the center aisle, her eyes fixed on the altar at the far end of the room. The altar was adorned with the statue of the Virgin Mary, her serene face gazing down at the world below, hands open in a gesture of grace and mercy. Candles burned at her feet, their flames flickering gently in the still air, casting a soft, golden light around the statue. Lupita's heart raced as she approached, her bundle of roses feeling heavier, with each step. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. She had come here countless times before, lighting candles for her mother, praying for strength and healing. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she wasn't just asking for help, she was begging for a miracle. When she reached the front of the church, Lupita knelt slowly on the cold stone floor, the ache in her knees barely registering compared to the ache in her heart. She placed the wilted roses on the altar, her fingers lingering on the fragile petals for a moment. These flowers were a reflection of her own spirit, tired, fading, clinging to life, but losing the fight. For a long moment, she simply knelt there, staring at the roses, her breath coming in slow, shallow waves. Her mind raced with memories, with fears, with a deep, overwhelming sense of helplessness. She had been raised in the church, taught to believe that God would never abandon her, no matter how dark things seemed. But now, with her mother's illness worsening and her shop on the brink of collapse, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been forgotten. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision as she stared at the Virgin Mary's peaceful face. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her despair. "Why won't you hear me?" Her voice echoed softly in the empty church, bouncing off the stone walls and fading into the silence. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Lupita lowered her head, her hands clasped together in front of her, fingers gripping tightly, as though holding on to her faith with all that she had left. The tears came then, hot and fast, spilling down her cheeks in silent streams as her shoulders shook with the sobs she had tried so hard to hold back. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've tried everything. I've given everything. I don't have anything left." Her words trailed off into the stillness, her heart heavy with the weight of it all. She had always been strong, always the one to take care of others, especially her mother. But now, she felt so small, so fragile, like a single drop of water trying to survive in a vast, empty desert. She needed something, anything, to show her that she wasn't alone, that her prayers weren't in vain. With a shaky breath, Lupita raised her head and looked up at the statue of the Virgin Mary. The flickering candlelight seemed to give life to the folds of her robe, the gentle curve of her face, her outstretched hands. Lupita's eyes filled with a deep yearning, a desperate plea that could not be put into words. She needed a sign, something to hold on to, something to believe in. "Please," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "If you're there, if you hear me, show me. Show me that you're listening." For a moment, the only sound in the church was the soft crackle of the candles, their flames swaying gently as if responding to her prayer. Lupita waited, her heart pounding in her chest, hoping for something, anything. A flicker of light, a gust of wind, a feeling of warmth. But there was nothing, just silence. She exhaled slowly, the weight of disappointment settling over her like a heavy cloak. Maybe she had asked for too much. Maybe miracles weren't meant for people like her, ordinary, struggling, small. Her tears fell silently onto the stone floor as she lowered her head once more, the last of her hope slipping through her fingers like sand. But then, something stirred inside her, a faint whisper in the back of her mind, a feeling that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but a quiet reassurance that seemed to rise from the depths of her soul. It was as if, in the stillness of the church, in the silence of her despair, she had been heard after all. Lupita blinked, her tears slowing as she lifted her head once more. The roses still lay on the altar, wilted and tired, but something about them felt different now. They were no longer just dying flowers. They were an offering, her last, fragile act of faith. And that somehow felt like enough. She stood slowly, her legs weak and trembling, but her heart a little lighter. Lupita wasn't sure what would happen next, or if anything would change. But as she turned to leave the church, she carried with her a small, quiet hope. It wasn't a blazing fire, but a flicker, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, faith could still survive. As she walked out of the church and into the night, the cool breeze kissed her tear-streaked face. The city was still quiet, the streets mostly empty, but Lupita felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had given everything she had to God, laid her burdens at his feet. Now, all she could do was wait. Her footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestone streets as she made her way back home, the bundle of roses still resting on the altar behind her, a symbol of her silent plea. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. There was something comforting in the act of surrendering, in trusting that somehow, in some way, she had been heard. And with that faint hope, Lupita walked back into the night, the city lights glowing softly in the distance, like stars guiding her through the darkness. Part 3. The Morning of Miracles. The first light of dawn crept into the dimly lit room as Lupita stirred from a restless sleep. Her small bedroom above the shop felt colder than usual, the thin blanket doing little to protect her from the chill of the early morning. She hadn't slept well, the weight of last night's prayer still heavy on her heart. Her eyes, swollen from the tears she had shed in the church, fluttered open as she lay there for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the city waking up. The usual clatter of the street vendors setting up their stalls and the distant murmur of early morning chatter drifted up to her window. It was another day, but for Lupita, it felt like nothing had changed. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to push away the lingering sadness that had settled into her bones. She had prayed, begged for help, and though the silence had been deafening, a small flicker of hope remained within her. Sighing deeply, Lupita swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her feet cold against the wooden floor. She pulled on her worn shawl, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders for warmth, and made her way downstairs. The familiar scent of roses, though now mingled with the faint aroma of decay, greeted her as she descended the narrow staircase into the shop. Each step was deliberate, her heart heavy with the thought of facing another day of struggling sales and fading flowers. The shop was still cloaked in the soft shadows of dawn. She reached for the light switch, her fingers grazing the cool metal, when something made her pause. A faint, sweet scent reached her nose, a fragrance that was unmistakable, the scent of fresh roses. It was stronger than she remembered, almost overpowering, as if the shop had been filled with the freshest blooms. But she knew that couldn't be possible. The flowers had been dying, the petals brittle, their color nearly gone. Her hand hovered over the switch for a moment longer, her brow furrowing in confusion. Slowly, with cautious steps, she moved toward the window where the vase of roses had stood the day before. Her heart pounded in her chest, the air thick with an almost palpable sense of anticipation. Something felt different. The shop was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of despair. It was something else, something alive. Lupita's breath caught in her throat as she reached the counter and laid her eyes on the roses. They were perfect. Every petal was vibrant, full of life and color, as though they had been picked fresh from a garden only moments before. The crimson hue of the roses was deeper, richer than she had ever seen, and the soft, velvety texture of each petal glistened with droplets of dew. They were not just revived, they were transformed. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the flowers, afraid that somehow this vision would vanish the moment she made contact. But when her fingers brushed against the soft petals, they were real, softer and more alive than any flower she had ever held. "How?" Lupita whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She leaned in closer, inhaling the sweet fragrance of the blooms, her mind racing to comprehend what she was seeing. These were the same roses she had brought to the church the night before, the same flowers that had been wilted, dry, lifeless. She had seen them with her own eyes, watched as they slowly withered away in the shop. And yet, here they were, renewed, more beautiful than they had ever been. It was impossible, and yet it had happened. Her knees felt weak, and she sank down onto the stool behind the counter, her mind spinning with the enormity of what she was witnessing. It was a miracle there was no other explanation. She had gone to the church, laid her last bouquet at the altar, and pleaded for a sign. And now here it was right in front of her. Tears welled up in her eyes again. But this time, They were not tears of despair. They were tears of awe, of wonder, of gratitude. She had been heard. God had answered her prayer. Lupita sat there for a long moment, simply staring at the roses, her heart swelling with emotion. This wasn't just about the flowers. It was a sign that she wasn't alone, that her struggles had not gone unnoticed. It was as if the roses themselves were speaking to her, whispering that there was still hope, still life to be found, even in the darkest moments. As she wiped her tears away, a sudden knock on the door startled her from her reverie. Lupita quickly stood and hurried over, unlocking the door and opening it to reveal a woman from the neighborhood standing on the other side. Her name was Dona Carmen, an elderly woman who had often bought flowers from Lupita in the past, but hadn't visited the shop in months due to the economic downturn. "Buenos dias, Lupita," Dona Carmen greeted her, her eyes warm but curious. "I was passing by and smelled the most beautiful scent. Are you open?" Lupita blinked, still dazed by the miracle she had just witnessed. She glanced back at the roses, then nodded slowly, opening the door wider to let Dona Carmen inside. The older woman stepped in, her eyes immediately drawn to the vase of roses on the counter. She gasped softly, her hand rising to her mouth. "Dios mío, these are the most beautiful flowers I've ever seen," she exclaimed, her voice filled with awe. "How did you get them to look like that? I've never seen roses so perfect." Lupita felt a lump form in her throat, her heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and quiet reverence. I don't know," she replied softly, her voice trembling with emotion. It's a miracle." Dona Carmen turned to her, her eyes wide. "A miracle? Tell me, Lupita, what happened?" Lupita hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain what had transpired. The memory of her desperate prayer in the church the night before was still fresh in her mind, the weight of that moment heavy on her heart. But as she looked at the roses, she realized that this was not something to keep to herself. This miracle was not just for her, it was for everyone who had lost hope, everyone who needed to believe again. So, she told Dona Carmen everything about the struggles with her shop, her mother's illness, and her desperate prayer in the church. She spoke of the wilted roses she had placed on the altar and how, when she woke up this morning, they had been miraculously restored. By the time Lupita finished speaking, Dona Carmen's eyes were brimming with tears. She reached out and took Lupita's hands in hers, squeezing them gently. "This is truly a gift from God," she said softly, her voice filled with reverence. "You must share this with everyone, Lupita. People need to know that miracles still happen." Lupita nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been given a gift, a sign that her faith had not been in vain. And now, she had a responsibility to share that gift with others, to spread the hope that these roses represented. As Dona Carmen left the shop, word of the miraculous roses spread quickly through the neighborhood. People began to gather outside, curious and eager to see the flowers for themselves. Lupita watched from the window as more and more people arrived, their faces filled with wonder and hope. The once empty shop was now bustling with life. And as Lupita stood behind the counter, gazing at the vibrant roses that had been restored to their full glory, she knew in her heart that this was only the beginning. The miracle of the roses had brought her hope, and now that hope was spreading to everyone around her. It wasn't just about the flowers anymore. It was about faith, about believing in something greater, even when everything seemed lost. And for the first time in a long while, Lupita felt truly alive. Part 4. A Garden of Hope Blooms. The days that followed the miracle were unlike anything Lupita could have imagined. The once quiet florist shop, where she had sat in solitude, surrounded by wilting blooms, was now brimming with life. People from all over the city came to see the miraculous roses, each visitor bringing with them their own stories of hardship and hope. It wasn't just the scent of fresh flowers that filled the air. It was the palpable feeling of renewal and possibility that hung over the shop like a warm embrace. The transformation was astonishing. From dawn until dusk, the little bell above the shop door jingled constantly as people came and went, eager to buy the roses de esperanza, the roses of hope, as they were now called. News of the miracle had spread far and wide, and it seemed that every person who entered the shop believed the roses carried a blessing. Word traveled from neighbor to neighbor until the story reached the ears of people beyond the city limits. Lupita found herself overwhelmed, not just by the sudden rush of customers, but by the outpouring of emotion that seemed to accompany each sale. People didn't just buy flowers. They brought with them their hopes, their fears, their deepest desires. Some came seeking comfort, others came searching for healing, and a few came simply to stand in the presence of what they believed to be a true miracle. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the windows in golden streams, Lupita stood behind the counter, watching a young couple approach the vase of roses. The woman, visibly pregnant, held her husband's arm tightly, her face filled with a mixture of awe and quiet reverence. As they approached the flowers, she gently rested her hand on her swollen belly, whispering something to herself. Her husband reached for a rose, handling it with the utmost care, as though he were cradling something sacred. The couple exchanged a look, their eyes brimming with unspoken emotion. When they came to the counter to pay, the woman hesitated for a moment, then turned to Lupita. "My husband and I, we've been trying for years to have a child," the woman said softly, her voice trembling. "Doctors told us it might not be possible, but now I'm pregnant and, well, I wanted to bring one of these roses home with us. I've heard they bring blessings." Lupita's heart swelled with warmth. She smiled gently, nodding as she wrapped the delicate rose in paper. "I'll be praying for you," Lupita whispered, her eyes meeting the woman's. "May this rose bring your family all the blessings you seek." The couple thanked her, tears in their eyes, and left the shop holding the rose as if it were a treasure. Lupita watched them go, her heart heavy with the weight of their hope. She realized that the roses were no longer just flowers. They had become a symbol of faith, of connection, of belief in something greater than themselves. As the days passed, more and more people came to the shop, each with their own story. An elderly man whose wife had passed away came to buy a single rose to place on her grave. A young mother, desperate to find work to support her children, came to the shop after hearing of the rose's blessings. A businessman, struggling to keep his company afloat, purchased a bouquet in hopes of a turn of fortune. It seemed that everyone who entered the shop left with more than just a flower. They left with a renewed sense of hope. And Lupita, who had once been burdened with despair, now found herself uplifted by the stories and the faith of those around her. The shop itself underwent a transformation as well. Where once the shelves had been bare and the counters dusty, they were now filled with vibrant blooms, each one more radiant than the last. The air was thick with the heady scent of roses, tulips, and daisies, and Lupita worked tirelessly to keep up with the demand. Every morning, new deliveries of flowers arrived from local growers, eager to be part of the phenomenon that had taken hold of the city. Her shop, once on the brink of closing, was now thriving like never before. But amidst the flurry of activity, there was one thing that remained constant: the original bouquet of miraculous roses. Lupita had placed them in a vase by the window, where they stood as a testament to the miracle that had changed everything. Though the days passed and the shop bustled with life, the roses showed no signs of wilting. Their petals remained vibrant, their stems strong, as if they had been frozen in time, untouched by the wear and tear that usually came with age. People would often stop in front of the shop window, gazing in wonder at the roses, their faces alight with awe and reverence. Some whispered prayers, while others simply stood in silence, as if waiting for something profound to be revealed. For Lupita, the roses had become a symbol of God's grace, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always the possibility of renewal. She couldn't explain the miracle that had taken place, but she didn't need to. The flowers spoke for themselves, offering hope to everyone who laid eyes on them. One evening, as the sun began to set and the last of the customers trickled out of the shop, Lupita stood by the window, gazing at the roses bathed in the soft glow of twilight. She had never felt so at peace, so connected to something beyond herself. The weight of her worries had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. She had been given a gift, not just in the form of the roses, but in the faith that had blossomed within her. It was then that her mother, Maria, called to her from the back room. Lupita hurried upstairs, where her mother was sitting by the window, gazing out at the fading light of the day. She looked stronger, her cheeks flushed with a hint of color that hadn't been there in weeks. The treatments were working, and every day, Maria seemed to regain a little more of the vitality that had once defined her. As Lupita sat beside her, her mother reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You've done something extraordinary, Mija," Maria said softly, her voice filled with pride. "These roses, they've brought hope to so many. And to me." Lupita smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's not me, Mama. It's God's work." Maria nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing peace. "Yes, but you were the one who had the faith to ask. Never forget that." Lupita blinked back the tears that welled up in her eyes, her throat tightening with emotion. Her mother was right. She had asked and God had answered. But it wasn't just her prayer that had been answered. It was the prayers of everyone who had come to the shop seeking hope. The roses were a reminder that faith, no matter how small or fragile, could move mountains. As the night settled in, Lupita sat with her mother, watching the stars twinkle above the city. The shop below them was quiet now, the flowers resting in the cool evening air. But Lupita knew that tomorrow, and every day after that, people would come, drawn not just by the beauty of the flowers, but by the promise of hope that they carried. And as long as the roses bloomed, Lupita would be there, ready to share the miracle with all who came seeking it. Part 5. The Eternal Bloom of Faith. Weeks had passed since the miracle of the roses, but the sense of wonder and awe that had surrounded Lupita's life had not faded. If anything, it had deepened. Her small florist shop had become a beacon of hope for the entire community, drawing people from all over the city and beyond. What had once been a humble, struggling business was now thriving, not just because of the miraculous roses, but because of the faith they had reignited in everyone who came to see them. But despite the success and the constant flow of customers, Lupita's heart was drawn elsewhere. The miracle had reminded her of something deeper, something that went beyond the physical beauty of the flowers. It was the faith that had brought the miracle to life, the quiet, unshakable belief that God was listening. And now, she felt a pull to return to the place where her desperate plea had first been heard, the church. On a quiet Sunday morning, just before dawn, Lupita made her way back to the church. The streets of the city of Mexico were still asleep, the air crisp and cool with the first whispers of the coming day. Her heart raced as she approached the familiar stone structure, the same church where she had knelt and prayed with all her heart, offering her last roses to the Virgin Mary in the hopes of receiving a sign. This time, however, her hands were not empty. She carried with her a bouquet of the very roses that had been miraculously restored, their petals still as vibrant and full of life as they had been the morning she had first discovered them. The roses had become a symbol, not just for her, but for everyone who had come to her shop seeking hope. And now Lupita was bringing them back to the place where the miracle had begun. The church was quiet, just as it had been that night weeks ago. The only light came from the candles that flickered on the altar, casting soft shadows across the stone walls. Lupita's footsteps echoed softly as she made her way down the center aisle, the bouquet of roses held gently in her arms. Her heart was full, not with the weight of desperation, but with gratitude, with peace, and with a deep sense of connection to the divine. When she reached the altar, Lupita knelt once more, just as she had before. But this time, there were no tears, no words of desperation. Instead, she placed the roses at the feet of the Virgin Mary, her hands lingering on the petals for a moment as she whispered a simple prayer of thanks. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft but steady, "for everything, for hearing me, for guiding me, for showing me that I was never alone." As she knelt there in the quiet of the church, Lupita felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of renewal. She had come full circle, from the depths of despair to the heights of faith, and now she was ready to move forward with a heart full of hope. But as she rose to leave, something caught her eye. The light from the candles flickered across the roses she had placed on the altar, illuminating them in a soft, golden glow. For a moment, Lupita could have sworn she saw the petals shimmer, as if the flowers were alive with a quiet, radiant energy. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in that moment she knew the miracle was still unfolding. As she turned to leave the church, Lupita couldn't help but smile. The roses, the faith they represented, the hope they had brought to so many people, it was all part of something much larger than herself. And as long as those roses bloomed, the miracle would continue to live on, not just in her shop, but in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by their story. The journey back to the shop felt lighter than ever before. The streets, now slowly filling with life as the city awoke, seemed brighter, more vibrant. The weight of her past struggles had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and peace. Lupita had found more than just success. She had found her faith again, and in doing so, had given that gift to countless others. As she approached the shop, Lupita paused for a moment to take it all in. The little florist that had once been on the verge of closing was now a place of joy and renewal. The windows were filled with fresh flowers, their colors bursting with life, and the sign above the door, Roses de Esperanza, glowed in the early morning light. Inside, she found her mother, Maria, sitting at the counter, her hands busy arranging a new bouquet of flowers. Maria looked up as Lupita entered, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. She had been getting stronger every day, her health improving steadily since Lupita had been able to afford the treatments. But more than her physical strength, there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a light of hope, of faith restored. "How was the church, Mija?" Maria asked, her voice gentle. Lupita smiled, setting down her bag and walking over to join her mother. "It was beautiful, Mama. I took the roses to the altar, and I thanked God for everything." Maria nodded, her eyes misting with emotion. "You've done something extraordinary, Lupita. This shop, these flowers, they've become a part of something much bigger than we ever could have imagined." Lupita took a deep breath, feeling the truth of her mother's words settle into her heart. "It's not about the shop anymore, Mama. It's about the people. It's about the hope that these roses have brought to all of us." Maria reached out and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "And that hope, Lupita, it will never fade, just like these roses." Lupita's heart swelled with gratitude as she looked around the shop, at the flowers, at the life that filled every corner. She knew now that the miracle wasn't just in the roses. It was in the faith that had been restored, the lives that had been touched, the community that had come together in belief and hope. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Lupita and her mother worked side by side, preparing the shop for another day. The bell above the door jingled softly as the first customer of the day entered, and soon, the shop was once again filled with the sound of laughter, of conversation, of people coming together in the shared belief that miracles were possible. And as long as the roses bloomed, the story of their miracle would continue to spread, weaving its way through the hearts and lives of everyone who touched them. Lupita knew, deep in her soul, that the faith that had brought the miracle to life was eternal, just like the roses themselves. And in that knowledge, she found peace. The roses of hope would never wilt. They would bloom forever, a testament to the power of faith, love, and the belief that, even in the darkest of times, there is always a light waiting to guide you home. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.